Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to begin with this land acknowledgement made by Native students at UC Berkeley.
UC Berkeley sits on a territory of
the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land
of the Chochenyo speaking Ohlone people,
the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868.
Support local businesses owned by Native peoples.
Make a donation to the Shumi land tax, which directly supports Sagora T's work of rematriation. We are still here.
We are still here.
We
are still here.
We are still here.
Thank you to the American Indian Graduate Program for their video and the permission to use it here today. My name is Karen Bennett, Associate Curator for Education here at BAM PFA, and it's a true pleasure to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a fascinating and convivial program. It's occasioned by the exhibition, of course, Amalia Mesa Baines' Archaeology of Memory, a stunning retrospective of a brilliant artistic career, co-curated by Esther Fernandez and Professor Lara Perez. There are many people and several foundations to thank for their support of the exhibition and its related programming. Thank you to the Henry Luce Foundation and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for their generous lead support. Major funding is provided by Margarita Gandia and Diana Campoamor, Marta Tomahal, Pamela and David Hornick, and the UC Berkeley Latinx Research Center. Additional support was provided by a College of Letters and Sciences Dean's Faculty Excellence Program Project Grant, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And this particular event today is co-sponsored by the Jane Green Endowment for Studies in Art History and Criticism at Mills College, Northeastern University. We're happy to have members of the Mills community with us here today, and I'd also like to welcome the members of US Latinx Art Forum who are here with us today. And very quickly, I'd like to mention that Amalia Mesa Baines will give a solo artist talk on Sunday, March 19th at 1 p.m. in this theater. So please come back then to hear more from her about her work. And after the talk, she will sign copies of the exhibition catalog, which is gorgeous, as well as informative. So today's program, conceived of as a conversation rather than a sequence of individual presentations, brings together four scholars, two of whom are art historians, two of whom are practicing artists, one of whom is the subject of the conversation. Guess who? Jennifer Gonzalez is a professor in the history of art and visual cultures at UC Santa Cruz. Her research engages political and theoretical discourses and their intersection with critical race scholarship on contemporary art. She's widely published in many journals and exhibition catalogs and is the author of two books, Subject to Display, Reframing Race in Contemporary Installation Art, and a book about the artist Pepon Osorio. She is the chief editor of Chicano and Chicana Art, a critical anthology, published in 2019. And Jennifer's essay in the catalog for this exhibition is titled Unruly Erotic. Adriana Zavala is an associate professor at Tufts University in the departments of the History of Art and Architecture and Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. Her writing and curating has focused on artists and intellectuals who have shaped modern Mexican, Latin American, and U.S. Latinx art history. She is working on a book, working title Unsettling Brown and Black, which will explore Latinx visual artists who critically engage with the legacies of colonialism across the Americas. And she is currently a research fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Her essay in the exhibition catalog is Flowers and Songs, Memory, Nature, and the Empowered Feminine in the Prints and Books of Amalia Mesa Baines. Sandy Rodriguez is a Los Angeles-based artist and researcher whose work investigates the methods and materials of painting across cultures and histories. Her Codex Rodriguez Mondragon is made up of a collection of maps and paintings about the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. She has exhibited at a number of museums and cultural institutions, including the Denver Art Museum, the Hunting Library Art Museum and Botanical Garden, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And recently she was awarded the Caltech Huntington Art and Research Residency, Creative Capital Award, and Migrations Initiative from Mellon Foundation, Just Futures Initiative, and Global Cornell. And the woman of the hour, Amalia Mesa Baines, is an internationally renowned artist, scholar, and curator who has been involved in the Chicana artist movement since the 1960s. A leading installation artist and MacArthur awardee, Amalia incorporates Chicano culture and folk traditions into her work, drawing on themes inspired by Catholic rituals, Mesoamerican religious imagery, Chicano history, and female rites of passage. Throughout her career, she has expanded understanding of Latina artists, references to spiritual practices, and vernacular traditions through her altar installations, articles, lectures, and exhibitions. Her work has been shown at institutions such as the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, the Whitney Museum of American Art at Philip Morris, the New Museum, and numerous international venues. She founded and directed the Visual and Public Art Department at Cal State University at Monterey Bay, where she is now Professor Emerita. Her community work includes trustee and advisory board positions with the Mexican Museum in San Francisco, Galeria de la Raza, and the Social Public Resource Center in Los Angeles. So for today's program, Jennifer and Adriana have imagined some general prompts for discussion, while Sandy and Amalia each suggested one artwork by each other as a possible reference point for the conversation. Sandy selected this work, and there's three views. It's Curanderas Botanica by Amalia Mesa Baines. It is in our exhibition galleries. And Amalia selected Mapa de las Child Detention Centers and Family Separation and Other Atrocities by Sandy Rodriguez. And here's a detailed view. And we'll bring those up for viewing when they're mentioned in the conversation. Thank you, and I invite the conversants to begin.
Thank you, Karen. And is the mic working? Thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction and for organizing and all of your wonderful support throughout this whole process with Amalia's exhibition. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. My name is Jennifer Gonzalez, and I'm starting us off with some questions to think about some of the early period of Amalia's work. And I wanted to just quickly begin by asking Amalia, how did Chicana art and Chicana feminism and its own creative, critical practice influence your early work? And how, as an artist, did you develop through and against different forms of feminism in both the construction, the selection of themes and topics, and your own development as an artist?
Well, I have to tell the truth, don't I? In the early Chicano movement, which I consider now in retrospect as quite patriarchal, there really wasn't, there really wasn't a feminist movement. There were feminists, and to be sure, people like Yolanda Lopez, Judy Baca, and later Esther Hernandez, all were women who were associated with other feminists. Judy Baca was very close to Suzanne Lacey and Judy Chicago, and Yolanda Lopez was mentored and taught by Martha Rossler. So I did not have that experience. I was a little older than them. I came in really in the midst of what I considered a movement for social justice, and I took on a particular role that was, I don't think it was assigned to me. I might have assigned it to myself, but it had to do with my interest in the traditions of the dead. And my mentor was Yolanda Garfias Wu. Those of you in the Bay Area very well know her name, because she was one of the earliest public practitioners of the Days of the Dead. She's Oaxaqueña descent and traveled to Latin America and Mexico every year for at least 30 years, studying backstrap loom, documenting all the textile patterns. So there were women close to me, women who influenced me, but it wasn't through the lens of feminism. And I look back now and I think about, how did that happen? How did I become, in some sense, perceived as a feminist? I am a feminist now, but I don't think I was then, because I don't think that the language, the leadership, and the issues fit me. They didn't fit many of us. Our strength lay in the women often in our family, our grandmothers to be sure, and our mothers. And so it's that old saying, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There was no way ever that people like myself and most of the women that I consider my co-mothers, I just don't think we could have turned away from that. But when I look at my own work, I realize, and Tomás Ibarra Frausto called it my pantheon of homenajes, my homages. And they were to women related to my mother's generation, the movie star Dolores Del Rio, who also became an activist in Mexico when she went back there after she grew too old to be in U.S. movies of exotic glamour. Frida Kahlo, for sure. I think I visited her house in the very early 70s, 71, 72. And, but she was already enthroned through the work of Rupert Garcia, Renee Yanez, and others. So there were men who looked to some of the feminist figures. But I would say that I came upon it when I tried to make sense out of what it was we had experienced. And so the issues of labor, history, religion, and family were the sources of my first thoughtfulness about what it meant to be a feminist. So for me, the feminist leaders who were like people like Emma Tenayuca, who fought the Pecan strikes in Texas, or Josefina Bright, or Luisa Moreno, who fought the labor fights in AFL-CIO and in the sweatshops of sewing factories, and of course, Dolores Huerta, without saying. And so I looked at those first, and then interestingly enough, two of my most feminist icons are Santa Teresa de Avila and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And everyone goes, why did you pick nuns? And I said, well, because they both fought so hard to have the freedom of thought, the liberation of mysticism and faith in times when that was simply not allowed for them, and they paid very high price for it. So my choices about feminism certainly wouldn't have held up in a white feminist world. I think I was practicing intersectionality before I even had a word for it. And so when I look back on it now, my piece that I wrote in 1992, which ironically I wrote while on the Côte d'Azur in France in a retreat, locked in some sort of chalet or whatever it was, chateau, and everyone else was all naked on the beach, and I was writing away because I wanted to explain how rascuachismo for women was different than it was for men. I wanted to explain how rascuachismo, making the most from the least, was not kitsch, which in my mind were mass-produced objects of, curiosity and use by artists. So when I wrote it, the only person that I found that made sense for me at that time really was the kind of writing that, oh my God, she skipped my mind. You know her. No. It'll come back. I'll tell you later. But she wrote about something called the sewing room. And I thought that was very similar to our notion of using domestic work to pry open the patriarchy within our own homes and within our own communities. And so I began to write from that perspective, using the altar, Patricia Rodriguez's sewing box, all of these pieces that I saw as making the most from the least, but also questioning the way in which women were suppressed within their own domestic space. So that's how feminism came about for me. But my emergence really came out of a movement of solidarity and social justice, which was oppressive in its own way. And there were moments, bursts of energy of women, young women, in the Southwest, in many of the gatherings where they tried to rise up and demanding a bigger role. It often went nowhere, but I think what showed up is a generation later. You see now, and now 2 or 3 generations later, you see the power of the women in both Chicano and Latinx societies. I mean, we are a different kind of feminist, and that's how it was for me.
Wow. I think we could just talk about that for an hour, but it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Karen, for organizing this, and thank you, Amalia, for inviting me to collaborate with you. So I wanted to invite you to tell us more about how materials that you use express personal, familial, and community connection. But I'm also really interested in how materials possess a vital force. You know, these days within the academy, there's a school of thinking about materials and vibrant matter. But I think this is, again, something that is just fundamental to what you do. So I wanted to sort of ask an open question to invite you to share with us how your materials have a vital force, a life force, and how that connects to family, to community.
Well, first I have to say her name, Griselda Pollock. Please forgive me, Griselda, wherever you are, for forgetting her name. But the question of materiality, it's funny because I often have conversation with other artists about it. Patsy Valdez and I were once trapped in a train station in Lyon, and we couldn't move our suitcases because we bought too many things and it was too heavy. And so we just sat on our suitcases and we discussed color. And Patsy, as you well know, has very vibrant color, and many of her works have activity in them. The chairs spin, the knives fly through the air, the windows flip open, things happen. And so when we were talking about it, she said, well, you know, I think they have like a valence. So when you put 2 colors together, they will vibrate. And so we know that in terms of color theory, but she meant something else. And so we began talking about why we choose what we choose. And I came to the conclusion that the story I'm trying to tell is what drives the material. So I'm not a formalist. I'm not well trained in any given medium. I was a fairly bad painter because I didn't have good color sense, except for my metal flake spray painting. That was really good. But beyond that, no. I draw moderately well, but not like people who really can draw. And I didn't really do sculpture, but I tried, and I was a bad printmaker. So this is embarrassing to say, but so I found my way to making things that I needed. And so I had all the domestic skills. I could embroider, I could crochet. I knew how to do all those things. And so that's why you find a lot of fabric and textiles in my work. My mother was a frustrated fashion designer and used to make my clothes by putting together different patterns so she could copy a Dior or a YSL. And I'm still a victim of that, I'm sorry to say. Fashion victim to the end. But the fabric was part of it. And then later, it became not just the story I wanted to tell, but who I wanted to hear the story, to see the story. So I developed what I later thought of as terms of inclusion, materiality of engagement. So I used mirrors because it reflects people and they get caught up seeing themselves in it. And now in the age of selfies, people take all their pictures in my mirrors. And so those places where I also had to contend with museums and their boundaries. And being as unruly as I am, it was very difficult for me. We had lots of prolonged arguments over the years. And I didn't move into big museums till the 80s. So the first 20 years, much of that work is not visible because it was ephemeral. That was the other part of it. Ephemeral and momentary work, what I call the fugitive moment, has all the power because it cannot be contained, it cannot be owned, it cannot in any way really be fixed in time. And that's why it's so beautiful. It's why people lay flower patterns. I saw a picture today of all places, Brussels. I thought we only did it in Mexico, where they've laid a road of flower petals in the pattern of an oriental carpet. And of course, the wind will blow it away. If it rains, it's gone, whatever. But why? Why would we do that? We would do that because the momentary carries all the passion and love that we have, and we give everything for that. So there's a part of that in the early years that I did, not for anyone else, but for myself. And then when I had to make work more permanently because I became ill and I wasn't sure how long I would work, I began trying to figure out how I could keep some of that ethos with the material that I use. So little by little, I made borders out of flowers. Then scent came into place. And then I realized, this is the next step in engagement, because the olfactory is as powerful as anything can be to trigger memories. So through all these works, there is a strand of memory, which is my own and is also shared by so many others. First, other Latinos, then women, then men that I know who are storytellers. And eventually I realized if you deepen the inspection of your own truths, your own failures, your own losses, the dearest things that you have that you don't have anymore, someone else will know that, and they will be there with you when they walk in. And so materiality to me is just a language, a way of telling the story.
It reminds me of the fact that we have so many practices of memory. And when I first encountered your work, it inspired me because I had been writing about collections of objects that people keep to tell their own life narratives, what I called autotopographies. Yes. And I called your installation practice a kind of autotopographical practice, where objects are collected and displayed and stored. And to me, that's a kind of radical practice for people who live under oppression or through migration, because it's about staking a claim and being able to say that these memories matter.
Yes.
And your work really moved me early on because it did that. I'm going to ask another question, which is about that, which is about coloniality, about the long, long history of forms of domination in the Americas. And I would say almost like a heartbeat or a vein or an artery, references to the colonial or the anti-colonial appear in your work in a kind of rhythmic, but often sort of subtle and hidden way. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the research that you do to prepare these installations, the historical research that you typically do for these installations, and how they do relate to a kind of larger anti-colonial practice.
Well, I think it always starts from the beginning with the movement itself, the Chicano movement, which was anchored for me in the two, poles we talk about, affirmation and resistance. And so the affirmation was to look at the things that belong to us, that gave us strength and resiliency, and lift those up for others to see. Because by and large, I think we were developing not just a cultural reclamation, but a sort of a visibility of truth, a way of being worthy, of fighting against the concept that we were not, that we were, what did he say? Trump, when he came down the stairs, he said, the Mexicans, yes, the Mexicans. They're all murderers and rapists. And I remember sitting there, this is like 100 years after I started all this stuff, and I thought, holy cow, we're so far back there, this is uglier than I ever remember. And it meant that we just have no choice but to do this work. And the counter-colonial elements came in because I wanted to respond first to the quincentennial, which was around 1992, and I started in 90. at the Mars Art Space doing that Undiscovering America, my first cabinet of curiosity. And those are the twin poles that the Spanish used. Speculare, to see the other, and curiositas, to know the other, the Latin terms for what drove them into the New World. Imagining sea beasts and Amazons, and then killing off millions of people with smallpox and war and brutality. So for me, the counter-quincentennial, which was being described basically as an international celebration, was so brutal, so vicious, so I couldn't tolerate it. And I was very lucky because Alicia Gonzalez, the very famous Alicia Gonzalez, just always remember her name. She's the reason the benign neglect report was written by the Hispanic Caucus, and she's the reason that many of us see now Latinas in the Smithsonian. I was collected, Papon was collected, Carmen was collected, Esther was collected. We were all collected because Alicia put her foot down and said something's wrong here. Latinos are treated badly in the Smithsonian and went all the way to the top. But she was in charge of the quincentennial celebrations in the Smithsonian. So she was like a mole. And so she sent us everything ahead of time. Oh, they're going to look at this, and they're going to look at that. Oh, and they're going to bring these people, and they're going to look at that. And so we began building counter-quincentennial projects across the country. And it wasn't just Chicanos, there were Latinos, especially in the Caribbean. So eventually the piece Queen of the Waters that is in the show, that went into Ante-America, or Before America, that was Carolina Ponce de Leon was curating it for the Biblioteca in Bogota. So all of these pieces, and the sesquicentennial drove me completely over the edge, because that is when we celebrate the loss of 51.4% of Mexico's northern empire, or everything that we know to be the Southwest. And especially for us in California, it was really, really totally insulting and offensive. But what were we to do? So that's when I started Private Landscapes and Public Territories, and ironically did it first in Copenhagen. In my career, it has been easier for me to do critical work outside of the US, where it's embraced, where it is supported financially and culturally and institutionally, and much harder here. But I think in the end, for me, it's really about looking at how this came to be. So, you know, Trump, what is that, like 2016? I don't even remember what it was. But I went farther and farther back every year. First, it was Cabinet Curiosity when I was doing Speculare and Curiositas. But then I started looking at Wunderkammers and how it was that Europeans came into the New World and found all these things and misnamed them and miscategorized them and generally plundered all of what we were and turned it into something it wasn't. Then I went to World's Fairs, because basically you're talking about colonialism hand in hand with scientific racism, which is what allows us to continue to see people of color all over the world in particular ways. So I did a World's Fair piece when Bernice Tampon opened the gallery in Miami, and it was called Fin del Siglo de Latino World's Fair. And I had a Hall of History, Hall of Science, Hall of Fashion, Hall of Labor. So each time that I pursued these ideas, I found new ways to work. So once again, the question that you have as an artist, and we usually only have 3 or 4 in our lifetime, and we don't let go of them because we're just very tenacious, because you don't get the right answer, so you do it again and again. And I pursued those questions for a good 30 years now. And I'm a little closer to understanding it, but I had to do a lot of research. I interview people a lot who are experts in a field because I don't want to make a mistake. So any project I take on, like the Wunderkammer that I did in the New World Wunderkammer for UCLA's Fowler Gallery, that took 2 years, 6 trips, 1 elbow replaced. I like to fit my surgeries in between my works of art. I can name every one of those works of art has some surgery associated with them. And I think sometimes that's what keeps me going. I'm very stubborn, and I think, well, I have to go back because I have to finish this. So just sew it up and let me go. But I still have a work to be done in the anti-colonial. My botanical studies, which I share with my sister Sandy, is really, it started back in '90. because I saw the Badianas botanicals for the first time, reproductions. And I thought, what is this? What is this? And then I came to find out that they were created by native people being schooled by Spaniards. And then the maps, cartography, the Lewis and Clark, I mean, all of these voyages of discovery were never that. They were voyages of conquest. They used maps to find out where everyone was and to put them in another place and call it something else. They used botanicals to rename the landscape and the botanical life according to their familiarity in Spain. All of the things that are part of what we admire in the West, our Westward movement, are just part of something that created so much pain and loss and was fostered by greed, not by science. Yeah.
Thank you, Amalia. Wow. So I think I'm going to build on that a little bit for this fourth conversation prompt, because no, I know. So you can segue here, but you mentioned resistance and affirmation, and these are two such important principles to the Chicano movement, to the Nuyorican movement, to the African American struggle in this country. So I do want to just invite you to talk, even if briefly, about your role as a curator. So as those of us who've spent time looking at the exhibition see the way that Amalia assembles images, objects, materials in order to tell stories and to critique oppressive structures. But many of you may not be aware of the fact that since the 80s, Amalia was actually curating exhibitions of the work of other artists. And so, I think this goes back to your Dia de Muertos exhibitions, but in particular, Amalia, I'm telling the audience, she curated a show called Ceremony of Memory for the Center for Contemporary Art in Santa Fe in 1988, Ceremony of Spirit, Nature and Memory in Contemporary Latino Art at the Mexican Museum in San Francisco in 93, and then The Art of the Other Mexico, Sources and Meanings for the Mexican Fine Arts Center Museum in Chicago in 93. And, what I want to say is that it feels right now, for those of us who are invested, and obviously some of us have been invested for quite a long time, that Latinx, Latino, Latina, Chicano art is having a moment, but there's an art history here. And what I'm interested in is the way that Amalia stepped out of her role as an artist and lifted up the work of other artists in these exhibitions. So I'm wondering if you see a connection here. I mean, this is a very multimodal kind of practice.
It is. And it probably springs to some degree from my own background. I'm third generation intermarried in my family. My grandmother, who was also mixed blood African, indigenous, and Spanish, but she was quite African looking. She was married to an American Black in, Imperial Valley, back in probably, I can't even think how long ago it would have been, maybe the 30s. It did not end well. It was a hard time to be different. And then, of course, my life with Richard Baines has propelled me into a part of a Black experience that was not common to me, because in my family, we just said, oh, they're dark, but, Mexicans come in every color. And we really didn't have the capacity to acknowledge what was going on in my own family. So that was my first step outside of the Chicano Onda, which was to look at Africanness in Mexico and in Chicanos, and how those were wedded. Then a phenomena happened to me. I went to New York, and I've often been asked, what do you think was the turning point in your career? And I would say it was Inverna Lopez bringing me to New York for INTAR, which no longer exists, but they're doing an archive on it now, for a show called Chicano Expressions. And then she gave me a solo show, and I did Grotto of the Virgins. But what happened was I met people like Juan Bosa, Rima Cardillo, Uruguayan, Ismael Frigerio, Chileno. I met, Catalina Parra. God, that blew my mind. There were people who were making work that had some affinity to what we were doing, but I didn't quite get it. And I remember Juan Bosa and he was from Cuba, Marielito Boatlift, a practitioner. I think it's Santeria, but he was from another sect. And we were at the Museo of the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art at the same time, and we sat back to back. And he looked at my slides, and I looked at his slides. And we were holding them up to the light, and everyone sort of turn around and look at each other, and then put more slides up. And finally, we just sat there in silence, and I realized, what is it? Mi otro yo. You are the other me. I mean, he's not alive anymore, but, he's still considered one of the greats. And that was when I began to ask myself questions. What is it we share? And I think curatorial thinking comes out of the observation of practice. I don't think it's surely a theoretical practice. It gets there, but that's not where it begins. I feel it begins when you notice things that other people do that seem sensible to you, but they're coming from a different perspective. So I began visiting with artists there, making studio visits, interviewing people, and eventually Ceremony of Memory came first. And that was the first one where I brought Chicanos along with Caribbean artists, Angel Rosado. I mean, there were people doing incredible work. Brazilians, the Brazilians, because they also shared certain aspects of spirituality. And I wrote for that catalog, and I moved through that. And then a few years later, I realized I hadn't gone far enough. It wasn't just about memory, because up until that point, for people who don't know, the big shows that were traveling around the US, and this was the multicultural age of the 80s and 90s, were being grouped by ethnicity. Chinese American shows, Japanese American shows. And I thought, no, it's not that simple. There's something else. And for me, it was memory. I have a little slogan: memory is the bridge between the living and the dead. It's between the past and the present, and it's our view of the future at some point. So memory was the first one, Ceremony of Memory. But then I realized spirituality has something to do with this practice and these images that keep coming up. So that was the second one, and that went further into Latin America. And I discovered something. I wish I had a chalkboard, because I'm a teacher at heart. I discovered that the Latin Americans who had been under dictatorships for decades, brutal dictatorships, we all know about them, they had learned to make work that was covert, because being caught with more than 5 people in your studio could mean going away, disappearing, desaparecidos. Chicanos, on the other hand, were living in a country that kept pretending that it wasn't as racist as it was. And it was like gaslighting. You're going like, I'm sorry, but you did say that, didn't you? Oh, no, that's not what I meant. And so our work became more overt. So it had a higher palette. It was more graphic. It was strong and bold. But in Latin America, subtle, layers, palettes low. I mean, it was completely different. I remember putting together for myself a little schematic so I could understand why had this happened. It's completely different now because the globalism of the world has changed all of our experiences. But curatorial practice to me is just a way of enhancing your own knowledge and lifting up others, because none of us, especially those of us who began in a movement, can really afford to go it alone. We're not alone. I mean, I have people in this audience today who were not raised the same way I was, but whose work is so valuable and important that I write about it. I'm happy to support them. I think it's really important. There is a sort of 19th century version of the artist as this, bedraggled individual who wastes away in a garret someplace. It isn't like that. We work together. Yeah, we compete sometimes, but in the Latino and Chicano community, you cannot afford competition. It is so slim out there, so hard to get shows, so hard to get support, so hard to get work that should have been collected decades ago into permanent collections. I mean, that's what we're here for. We cannot change the understanding of history if the institutions of history, education, museums, are not changed. Film, all of it must be changed, and that could only be done by scholars and artists and thinkers who are willing to push it. I was joking earlier how when I first started, It was a wonder I never got any shows. One of my jobs was to insult museum directors. I was so good at it. I was so good at it. And they'd invite me, and I'd think, why are you inviting me? One of them, I told him, he was a scholar. I said, I don't really like your book, and I disagree with it, so I don't think it would be good for me to come. No, I really want you to come. I want to know what you think. And so I said, okay. And I went and I said what I thought, and I showed a slideshow, and I was an endowed lecturer, and they were having a fancy dinner for me, and he left me there. It was pouring rain. He went to the dinner without me. Thank God the Chicano students, they came and got me. They had an umbrella. They took me to the dinner, by which time he had drunk way too much and made a toast to me that was sort of what they call the left-handed compliment. He said, and thank you for that extremely long lecture. And so when it was over, I thought, okay, can't go there again. So, as I did that, I began to realize that we had become court jesters. These are the end of the 80s to the mid-90s. We were entertaining them. They were using it to say that they had, in fact, invited the critique. But in the end, nothing ever changed. But what has changed now, I look out at Sonia, I look out at Mary and Michelle, and so many others here. Maria Castro at SF MoMA, Marcela Guerrero, senior curator at Whitney. Hey, it's time. They are the reason this is changing, because we have grown up 2 generations now who have been able to get an education and get the credentials, to get hired, to get in a museum, to be able to ask the questions that should have been asked 20 and 30 years ago. So that's why curatorial is important. And now can I ask Sandy a question?
Do you want to bring an image up?
Yeah, I want to bring Sandy's image up if we can, Karen. I started seeing Sandy's work, of course, on social media because I couldn't go anywhere during COVID. And besides just being absolutely amazed, I was so deeply touched because sometimes the work we did in the early generation seems like it got lost along the way. And then when I saw Sandy's and saw that she started in a different way, and we were imagining the Mesoamerican world. We were not scholars. You were at the Getty. And so I want to know what it was like to see real things. And then if you would talk a little bit about your materiality, the paper, the pigments, and what you just told us about the abalone shell.
Well, I'll tell you that I'm 3rd generation painter.
Here you go.
Abuelita, mi ama, rest in peace, and myself. They worked in European materials.
Yes.
Traditional oil paint, laid paper, wove paper, canvas. I went to school in the 90s with my mom at Cal Arts.
Wow.
At the same time. I had a very long practice of working in oil on canvas and European materials. I was working at the Getty as an educator for almost 16 years. Learned the methods and materials of European practice from medieval to 19th century. When I made the jump to make work full-time as an artist, I had that moment of really thinking about what it means to have the content and the form come together. It's when I started working with outlaw paper, amate. So amate was made illegal in the time of colonization. All of the códices, all of the histories, the genealogies, those libraries were burned. So if I'm telling stories of resistance, in our time, it has to be using those materials. I started doing botanical studies and field study. I started processing plants, pulling that life force, that connection with ecosystems into the material of paint, processing, levigating minerals to create these pieces. And engaging with the gut-wrenching news. This is 2018. This is family separation. This is child detention centers that are still in operation, and we're not talking about them. And so it's through the collapsing of generations and time periods that I'm able to take references from the Florentine Codex, that I'm able to take references from news stories, all of these details. And it's, really a process of being able to engage the broadest swath of audiences through these dialogues and conversations with a variety of scholars from various disciplines, because it's what we do. Yeah.
It's so fascinating. I wondered all along, how did you know about making pigments? And now I see that you grew up in a way in which you had a first-hand experience with that kind of materiality. That's very amazing.
I grew up in San Diego. Grandma's house is in Tijuana. We'd go over, and the painting studio was in the back. So it always smelled like Damar varnish and linseed oil and chicken soup.
Do we bring up Amalia's piece?
Sure. Absolutely floored by this piece. And I'll tell you that back in, my kind of education, I only had the opportunity to look at your work through slides.
Mm-hmm.
But to get to see this piece in person, I'm stunned. It is absolutely breathtaking. But I'm really curious about where and how you connect with family as you're preparing these. That portrait.
My grandmother.
I know. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your process in manifesting these installations and where and how it all takes place.
Well, family has been probably the through line besides the colonial. And I was thinking back about the idea of the vibrancy and where does that energy come from? And it really does come from stories of my family. My father was a great storyteller. My grandmother had come into the U.S. around, I think, 1917. My father was born in 1913, and he was born in Querétaro, which was the seat of the government at the time of the revolution. And there were cholera outbreaks, and they were piling bodies in the middle of the Zocalo, burning them. And I always wondered why my father had this very apocalyptic worldview. I didn't know where it came from. Then I read history and I went, oh, okay, that would do it. And so his stories were very much a shared one, and we could almost repeat them because he told them frequently, which we loved. Tell that one again, Dad, and then you would tell it again. And over time, I began trying to piece together that history because of the way she came into the U.S. And my grandfather, Raphael, worked for the Army. He got them their goods and services. So he signed a lot of the vouchers. So he was on the wrong side of the revolution, which as a Chicana was like wholly embarrassing. And I rarely ever talked about it because everybody else is so proud of their ties to Villa and Zapata. And I'm like, But those stories then became more precious to me because she was probably about 20. He was executed in front of her. They ran from the revolutionaries for a year or two before they were caught. He was executed. They cut off all her hair. If you look at the pictures, the young pictures of her that are in some of my pieces, totally beautiful woman. And she was a big woman. She was about 5'6", and she was born in the 1880s. So I couldn't tell, when Richard first came in my family, the first thing he said is, you didn't tell me your family was black. And I went, well, they're not. Mexicans come in every color. And then I thought, let me look at this again. And then I realized all these stories I'd heard as a child about my mailman is colored. And I'd say, no, that's my Uncle Johnny. He's just dark-skinned. He's Mexican, I started piecing it all together. I thought, oh, you're like really late on this, honey. You just did not see it, did not get it. And so I wanted to know more about it, but she was traumatized by all of it. And she was never going to speak of it again. They never went back to Mexico. My father only went back once with my husband, Richard took him. They just shut the door on that world. It was filled with so much pain and loss. And so I began to go through archives, and luckily, my grandmother, Mariana Escovedo, the woman who's a picture in the Curanderos Botanica, was the great-granddaughter of Mariano Escovedo, who was the general of the Northern Army of Mexico, who took the sword from Maximilian. So I come by my Francophile leanings, honestly. I can't help it. And so these histories then became almost like a research project for me. I wanted to know why. Why do you never talk about this? I tried asking her, she wouldn't discuss it. And so that's how family comes in. And then along the way, family intersects with history. You know, all of these events that we find out about as Chicanos when we're looking for that lost history. And then it begins to link to my own personal history. So Curanderos Botanica comes about within the years after an automobile accident, which I've told before. And it didn't happen in Paris, even though it's called The Road to Paris, and its aftermath is because when I came back from Paris on my 60th birthday, Richard took me to Paris, we had a car crash. And we were both hurt, but I was pretty severe. Broke my neck, my arm, my leg, and I broke my C1, which is, you know, where your spine hangs. So there were years and years of surgeries and recoveries, and I didn't make anything for 5 years, as longest in my whole life that I went without making anything. But then Franklin Simmons, who's now at Perez, was at Menil then, he was doing the show called Neo Hoodoo, Art of Another Faith. And I wanted to do something to help me get through this process. And Western doctors were limited, but my grandmother was not a curandera, but she practiced curanderismo, and she had healed my father of pulmonary diseases and of skin eruptions by feeding him food with snake powder, by making him drink the resin of pine branches. I mean, she had all these things that she could do. And so I went back to my studies of curanderismo because my PhD is in psychology, but one of my sidebars was looking at the role in which curanderismo could be useful in psychological settings. So I was friends with a number of other psychologists, Ronaldo Maduro and others who were using these techniques. So I went back to my books, and then I called a few people that were practitioners, and I got advice and found out immediately, of course, that in the sort of inventory of diseases, I had susto. So in curanderismo, the living and the dead are connected. The time you're in and the past time is connected. So the heavens and the earth, they're all connected. And that it is nature itself that heals. So that's why they use yerbas and all kinds of different things. And the other one that was really important is that we don't get sick by ourselves. We cannot be healed alone. So cures have to be collective and involve other members in your family. And at the same time, I had many, many friends, Pepon Osorio, for example, Marta Boneta Vega. Juan was gone by then, but people who are of Caribbean practitioners, and they came out, they flew out, they brought me polvos, I like things everywhere. And Pepon even got a little ladder and put a glass of water at the highest point of the house because that draws the energy out of you. So susto simply means shock and trauma, and my soul left my body. And that's why you have that apathy and that kind of listlessness. So this piece is all about the Western on the top and the curandera on the bottom. And the idea of vibrancy is that I use pieces that are part of my own life. So they're talismanic. Patsy and I used to talk about that and how you arrange objects. When two objects get closer together, the valence gets extremely intense. But if you quickly move them apart, it dissipates. So you know where you place things and how you place them. And particularly when they're luminous and they have transparency, there are many things you can do to create these waves of energy, which is something that I do with my work. And I rarely ever talk about it because I think people think I'm a little bit strange. But I think back to like what you do of mixing the pigments and using the forbidden papers. We know what we're making, how we make it, and what we make it of is part of the alchemical and mystical meaning to be an artist. It's not something, I say this often, I guess you could say it's a profession. It's certainly a skill set, but it operates in its own ethos apart from how other people make a living. Maybe writers and some scholars, but it's that materiality, that mixing of things. I put little, I sprinkle things in there that nobody even knows are there. And then before they used to get swept away. Now I have people, poor registrars, picking out little pieces of this and that. So I'm trying to be more considerate of the museum staff when I make these pieces. I'm already in a debate about the next round of when it travels, what should we do about the lavender? I can find moss that's synthetic and that's sort of on the edge of unacceptable, but it's okay. But I can't do that with lavender because you need the scent. So these pieces were part of that moment. And then they turned into something else, and that something else was aging. As I became older, more and more of the aspects of the body become dominant. Every morning I review, okay, how's my knee today? Oh no, oh, that hurts. And it's like trying to figure out, given the limits of the body that day, only that day, what could I do? What should I do? And so this piece is it's very much a marker in my life before the accident, my life after the accident, and the whole process of healing. And I've been thinking a lot about it. We're born and we die, and what is the space in between? I think it's healing, and I also think it's art. For us, it's art. That's our healing.
Amazing. Thank you.
Is there time for the audience? Is there time for the audience to ask some questions? Do we want to carry on a little longer, or should we go to the audience?
We have a moment for a little bit more between you.
Okay, great.
I'd like to connect to something that I was hearing just now in this conversation. And so I wanted to invite Sandy to tell us a little bit more about the experience of the kind of embodied historical memory experience of either imagined or real antepasados of dealing with these materials. Because if your training is in European materials and you let that go, and then you begin to study the Florentine Codex and the outlaw paper, and I know in some of the writing I've read about your work of going out on your own sort of expeditions to gather materials. It might be too private to share, and so I'll respect that, but I can sort of imagine what you're thinking about, both in the contemporary moment and also the experience. I'm familiar with the group of poets that you worked with for Project 1521. For those of you who may not know, 2021 was an anniversary of the destruction of the Aztec civilization by the Spaniards, and Sandy did this extraordinary collaborative project with some poets called Project 1521. So are you able to share a little bit about the intellectual process or the emotional process of delving into that?
And I'll tell you, it was 2017 when I left my museum work to make studio work full time. So I was able to research what I wanted to all day and make work and go out and do field study, right? It was that moment I began doing botanical studies in the Western United States, going out for 14 days at a time, completely off-grid with herbalists, learning about native plants, the entire plant communities, the bioregional kind of history. At the same time, I started looking into the Florentine. And Book 11 is the book of natural history that contains a treatise on color. understanding that within the art history of the Americas, that we have conceptual and spiritual relationships to color. Color creates the possibility of healing because of this larger connectedness. To infuse the fibers, to impregnate the actual fibers with this material that allows us to heal in this kind of chromatic way is something that really started me on a deep dive. And so over the past 7 years, it's been really an incredible journey to understand those relationships with plants, with minerals that are used in ceremony, that are used in ritual, that have been the material of painting since painting began. To be able to process and to hold those materials, because you crush those ochres, you wash all the impurities out, you grind it into pigment, you mix the binder. And when you're doing that and you have these earlier texts that you can recite as you're processing the color, there is that connectivity to all of the painters that came before you. There is this practice of communion and knowing that you're putting that forth and that those objects are going to be in conversation with collections of American art. You know, in working with the writers of Project 1521, I'm a convener. I bring people together. I invited a group of poets from all across California to come into the studio once a quarter. And having that background in education, I teach. So we'd come together, I would do an art talk, I would have them process materials, I would collaborate with the other members of the group to create a workshop, a writer's workshop. So we engaged with the primary sources. I would have Diana Magaloni talk about the materials, talk about the Florentine. It was like a study group. And then we would respond to all of those materials. And so when I would have exhibitions or when we would do readings, there was a performing of these objects. There was a way in which we invited everyone in, multiple generations. And, you know, it's something that I'd like to do more of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I see such a powerful connection between what you're doing at this stage in your career and what Amalia has done. These are really important interventions in knowledge systems, in theories of being. You know, this is about ontology. This is about systems of knowledge. And I take so to heart, first of all, and then to mind how important it is for your works to be in spaces that were not built for your works. They were spaces that were built for the pillage of other civilizations. And this is the connection I see to your work, right, in your use of materials. That, you know, you and I have talked about how challenging it's been for you as an artist and maker to have your work in museum spaces, not least because you pissed all the directors off. And
Besides that, it was the candles that...
Right. I mean, how is a museum going to store little boxes of lavender? Well, when they want to store dried birds that were pillaged by so-called naturalists, they find a way to do that. But so what I see so powerfully here is that these are not only works about stories that intervene, but in their materiality, they intervene. And that to me relates so in such interesting ways to the lives of the image makers in the pre-European invasion period, where they were really keepers of knowledge, and knowledge was in materials, right? The lamatinime, right?
Yes. Yeah, the tlacuilo, the artist, scholar, scribe.
I wanted to quickly follow up with that and ask a question about healing, because you were talking about healing, and I wanted to say that your work makes me think about the practice itself as a healing practice. And I wonder if you have more you'd like to add about that in relationship to Amalia's work and your own work, and whether about the materials in the process of healing.
I was so struck when I saw your codex that was in the label inspired by the Badiano. Yes. There is something about knowing and meeting and connecting with these medicinal plants. There is something about looking back at materia medicas like the Cruz Badiano and doing that deep dive and then working through all of those conversations to create something new.
And I think that in our generation, because there wasn't access, I think Jacinto Quirarte was the only Mesoamericans of our generation that was connected between Mexico and the U.S. So many of these things were not available to us, but we imagined them. So I feel like my whole life of the codices is sort of a made-up, imagined one, and yours is now the real one, the one I would like to have had. But I'm so happy that you have done it. It is so important. And I think that one of the reasons that we struggle so much with the sense of origin as a child who grew up in a time where you could easily be called wetback with not a blink of an eye. My mother used to laugh and say she was a wireback. But it was this idea of the migration. And I remember the whole idea of the corral, this little place in the backyard where they kept the plants they brought with them from Mexico. And they would sometimes, my grandmother would grow them in little coffee pots and, coffee cans and things like that, that we searched. And I think you have found that sort of space of where the plant becomes the magic of healing. So when you said chromatic spiritual, I just think I'm going to fall down on the ground. I don't have a pen, but I'm trying to keep saying it, so I won't forget it, but you can tell me
The
later.
chroma pharmacopoeia?
Oh, they're recording it? Oh, thank God. Because I think, I would love it if someday we would gather a group of the early people who worked in these forms and people like yourself and others, and that we could talk about what we share and that knowledge could be, sort of a pun, but codified in some way. When you were talking about the vibrancy and I talked about Patsy and the palette and the color, and then you were talking about chromatic spirituality, my mind was just spinning around trying to make these connections because I think they're there. And why, look at the Yaquis. Why did they keep coming back? They lived in an arid area. They had some plants, but it wasn't like they were in a fertile ground. And every time the Mexicans and later the Americans relocated them, they would take their money that they were given as whatever that, like sort of like a Bureau of Indian Affairs, whatever the money was coming from. And they would pull it together and send the youngest braves back and try to retake the land over and over and over again. They did it. And why? Everybody said, well, we gave them better land. And what they didn't understand, it's not about better land. It's about our land. It's about the space where you grew up, the plants your grandmother got for you. My grandmother grew mint outside the kitchen door. And if you even looked like you had a stomachache, yes, it fue. She'd get out there, she'd yank that, throw it in the boiling water, and you were made to drink it. And you had to hold your nose because I didn't like the smell. Now I do. And then found out later, of course, the Moroccans love this stuff. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's where she got it from. But this idea that plants can heal. I don't know if you ever saw the work that Celia Munoz did. She was the only Chicana ever in the Whitney Biennial at that point. And she did that, Plantas que curan, plantas que matan. And oh my God, that's the greatest piece. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece. So this through line of what grows and where it grows and what that means to us and how we use it in the foods we eat, in the ways that we healed. My grandmother grabbing those pine boughs, cutting them, putting them in these jars of water, and after a week she'd pull them out and she'd make my father drink like 2 or 3 glasses of it at one time. That's why in Curanderos Botanica, the 3 jars of the pine boughs are in the corner. And across from that is my father watching you. He is the large image of the young man with the pine bough and the snakeskin, and he's looking straight into Curanderos Botanica. Because he was my my healing guru. When I face anything, I remember and I say to myself, you are the daughter of Lorenzo Mesa. You can do this. This man lived through surgeries from the age of 70 to 90, cancer 3 times, 2 back surgeries, knee replacements, a brain tumor, everything. And the doctors would say, this might be the end. And we just burst out laughing, and they thought we were so cruel. And we'd say, no, you don't know him. He'll make himself walk down that hall in 3 days to 4 days so he can go home. Now, he may collapse at home and we'll all take care of him, but he had that DNA of healing. And we always maintain it's because she gave him the snake powder, which is why his skin, it sort of heals. It's like he can cut himself and a day later it's closing up. It's why all these years he took all those, what do you call it when you go under the anesthesia, that he could breathe through it, he could live through it, and he'd come out on the other end every single time. So I think that we need to share more of the understanding of how these plants and places bind us together. When you're talking, I feel like, I don't know, like you're my relative or something. I wish.
Thank you, Amalia.
We can get questions from the audience. Yeah. So there'll be a microphone.
There are 2 ushers with microphones, portable microphones. And if you raise your hand, a microphone will be brought to you.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. Amalia, I have 3 quick kind of images I want to toss at you. The first, I think, is very important. In the years that I've listened to you and learned from you, your humor is so important to the wisdom that you're sharing. And I think that's something that really needs to be understood, because, when you think about knowledge and wisdom, and it's always put kind of in an academic, dry format, but you have brought humor and life into these concepts, and I thank you for that. The second, I loved it when you were talking about aging and approaching aging parents. This is happening with me right now with a 92-year-old mother. And I find myself going each time to visit with one memory that I know has been passing through the family, to give it back to her.
Oh, good.
So that we can share it again. And that I was reminded of that. And then the final thing is, it's just a little story, but I think of it every time I think of you. You had the installation or the piece on Dolores Del Rio at the Oakland Museum one time. And so that's the first time I saw one of your pieces. I went there to see it. I thought it was beautiful. I was, like admiring it aesthetically. There was a mother and a father and a little boy, and they were there at the same time. And I saw that the little boy that the mother and father were not paying attention to started running to that installation to kick up the roses like leaves in the autumn. And his father turned around and saw this and ran after him and picked him up just before he was going to kick those roses up. And I think of that all the time.
Well, I'm sorry you grabbed him. I think kicking roses is a good thing. I did that piece in Sweden. Was it Sweden? Yes. And because, the absence of light there, they said we were like early spring. They loved our palette and our color. It was a show called Demande des Anges, a very large Chicano show. And what I remembered is the little girls came in their sundresses, and they had little big pockets in the front. And often, just before I leave, putting down all the potpourri, which is supposed to be a boundary, I throw some pearls in. I have bags of stuff, and I just throw them in, just so it makes the light shine. And they spent at least a half an hour walking around, picking the pearls out, putting them in their pockets. And the museum people were trying to get a little hysterical. And I said, no, it's okay. I've got bags more, It doesn't really make any difference. So I think those things are wonderful stories. I like stories that people interact. And in all the years I've been doing this, 50 years, I've lost one thing. No, I lost one whole installation in Europe, but that's another story. And that's if there were art detectives, or I would have been smart enough to try and hire somebody to find it. But the only thing I ever lost was at the Galeria de la Raza, and it was a little tiny porcelain hand. It was a pin I used to wear. And for whatever reason, I thought I needed it in there. So at the last minute, I took it off my lapel, and I put it and buried it sort of in the roses. And that was the only thing that's ever been taken. And yet for years and years, I've had to deal with museum people who freak out constantly over the details. You know, I understand because they feel the liability and the responsibility, but nothing is really that precious. And I'm learning now because after years of not selling anything, there is an interest in the work, and I have to reconcile that I'm giving them my life, that I'm giving them in the Curanderas Botanica. There are 5 shelves. Those 5 shelves are the shelves of my family, and they're all dead now, including my younger sister. So the thought that I'm giving that up is so hard. But the other reality is, you know, maybe 5, 10 more years I don't really know. But where would all that go anyway? So I'm starting to convince myself that museums are treasure houses of memory, and that my memories will become part of that place, and they'll be safe. In the Holy Communion piece that I sold to SF MoMA are my sister Judy's braids. And I want to tell you, I thought over and over again, should I go buy some of those braids that come from India or China? And then I thought, no. It's hers. It was supposed to be there. It will be there, and they'll take good care of it. And that's what you have to learn. These things might be in your lifetime symbols of love and power and meaning, but they'll translate into someone else's life at some point, and that's what you have to give up.
Hi. My question is for Amalia. I also just want to say thank you for the words you've shared thus far. But I was wondering about if you had any further elaborations on the presence of and like placement of fabric and its different iterations in your work. I was curious if there was any sort of something about the visual impression of fabric or any sort of symbology. Oh, I'm so sorry. That you might have imbued, the fabric with, what with fabric being just like this really charged material that can be projected onto quite literally, but also metaphorically, calling upon the home, the garment, the femme, the ceremonial, the hidden.
The body.
And I found it to be one of the most, I guess, glimmering things about when I was walking through the exhibition. And I was just so curious about it.
Thank you. I should let Jennifer answer that question. In the catalog, she wrote an essay, Unruly Erotic, I think, and I was really pleased because for years I've thought that my work has an undertone of the erotic, but it's never been claimed by anyone and never noted. And fabric is part of it, but there are other details. But the fabric, I think, for me, it came from 2 sources. My mother, that I mentioned earlier, and when I was a hippie, I want to tell you, I was the best dressed hippie ever. I was on the pages of Rags magazine, which was the year-long fashion magazine of Rolling Stone. So I have cred. So I want to say that. But the other part of it springs from the church. I was raised as a Catholic. My mother and father, I figured this out later, practiced birth control. That's why it was only my brother and I, and my sister was born late in life. So she didn't feel she could go to church. She had been part of her life, she had lived in a convent outside of Los Angeles, Italian nuns. And she'd gone there to be in school, but then Amalia, her mother, disappeared, and so she was put into the orphanage side. But she always said they saved her from ruin because they made her industrious. So when I would go to Sunday Mass, because my mother couldn't go, I was like this documentarian, and I would have to describe everything. I would repeat the gospel verbatim. I would collect the little newsletter the church put out. And in that newsletter, they had all the masterpieces, Caravaggio. They had all the ones that we come to know later. And they had the Baroque embellishments. My favorite time of the year was Passion Week, when everything was draped in purple satin. And I could hardly sit still. It was so beautiful. And I found later, my mother saved in a little shoebox all of the clippings that I cut out of the newsletter. And every one of them was one of those masterpiece paintings. So I realized later the church had been my first sort of vision of that kind of Baroque beauty. And it stayed with me. And so I've always liked draping, billowing. It's probably the source of one of my many pulmonary illnesses, because I used to go up on the cherry picker, staple the fabric billowing from the ceiling, and then I would spray paint it with gold and silver. But I wouldn't usually wear a mask because it would make my glasses fog up and I couldn't see. So in my early years, when I was at San Jose State in the 60s, my first exhibition was an award I got in the Phelan Show at the Pals Legion of Honor, and it was a metal flake sprayed piece. So I was a car art girl. I wore metal flake clothes. I hung out at car shops. I knew all about tuck and roll and all these, the George Barris fins and the car shows. I went with all my cousins. So the shimmer, the glitter, and then the Baroque fabric all it kind of came together. And over the years, I have piles yesterday, I'm weeding through piles and piles of hot pink satin that somehow I must have bought for something but never used. And this was after I'd already ordered Mood online, my favorite fabric store, something called beetroot silk chiffon. So that's coming, and I thought, why did I buy that? I've got all this hot pink satin. But so I really could have a fabric store in the back, because I use it because I think it frames the pieces. It's like a theater set. It reminds you of the Baroque. It is luscious and sensual, and sometimes it demarcates the body that is no longer there. And for me, as I age, it's a reminder of all the wonderful things that were made for me. I love clothes, and I love handmade clothes, and I'm really lucky because I was in fashion business in the 80s, a little bit in the 90s, beginning in the 70s, boutiques, then the Design Network. So I had a life in fashion off and on through all the years that I made art. And my former partner makes my outfits for when I go to the openings, because I like them to sort of match the event. So fabric is a part of that language of materiality that we talked about earlier, along with mirrors, glass, reflection. And I've been banned from glitter, so I had to give that up. Museums hate glitter because it floats in the air, clogs the vents, could get on the collection, so no more glitter.
Hey, first, thank you for sharing everything that you have today. I really appreciate that. I have a question in terms of, it talked about, coloniality, resistance, and affirmation. And to me, I always think of the other one. Amalia was bringing up the questions, right, that guide us as artists, right? And for me, the other one is reconnecting, right? As Chicanx people, reconnecting with the indigenous, right? Our antepasados, our ancestors who lost everything, right? We're thinking about these issues of detribalization, de-Indianization, deterritorialization, right? And so now, right, and I think for the both of you coming from two different generations, right, how, is your work in conversation with Chicanx indigeneity, right? As thinking about reconnecting, and one thinking of creating something, a new Chicanx indigenous culture for the future.
Oh, it's a big question. You and I have talked a bit about it already, because there are sentiments within some of the indigenous communities from Mexico that are here that don't welcome our embrace of the indigenous. Unlike Native Americans here in North America, there was no tribal registry. There was no Bureau of Indian Affairs. Mexico took on the policy, and it was quite superficial, of mestizaje, or the mixing of the races. So the only sense I think we have of that period of time and the combinations are the Castas paintings, which in of themselves are quite racist, but also really informative of what went on in that period. So we know now that the Africans that were brought in during the age of slavery or enslavement, large numbers came into Mexico and the Caribbean and Latin America, far, far more than ever went into the US. And that almost all Mexicans have some part of that. It's tercera raíz, the third root. But it's not openly talked about often, although now I think in these last 30 years there's more writing and discussion on it. But I think our dilemma is without a tribal registry or a Bureau of Indian Affairs, it is harder for us to identify in the lived sense what are our indigenous roots. I know Esther Hernandez, for example, comes from Apache. I've met some Chicanos from the North Tarahumara. I can't claim mine. I don't know where it is. I couldn't guess a little bit by the areas where my great-grandparents were born. So for us, when we were young and searching for that sense of, I guess, tribal history, we couldn't find it. But we did find the Mesoamerican. And we wedded ourselves to that, particularly the concept of Aztlán. And I think it was for a major purpose, which was we were living in a land that once belonged to us, but we were made to believe that we were outsiders, foreigners, immigrants, and yet the whole joke, we didn't cross the border crossed us. The terms of the internal colonial, which were part of the Almaguer and many other writers were quantifying for us. So we knew there was some source of that, but we could not name it. And so I think we took toward that indigenous history, the Mesoamerican history, for a sense of belonging. I wrote a piece, I think you've read it before, and this is part of a group, a multicultural group I belonged to in the 90s with Marta Bonero Vega out of the Caribbean Cultural Center. And it was a book, let's see the title of it. Mine was A Call to Indigeneity. The Battlefront. Voices from the Battlefront. So Asian Americans wrote, Native Americans wrote, Chicanos wrote, African Americans, Caribbeans wrote. We were all part of this group for about 10 years. And we hosted conferences primarily for ourselves, think tanks. And we divided ourselves up as scholars into writing, and we produced this book. And even when I was writing that, I knew that what we were identifying with was a vision of a certain philosophy that had to do with our place on the land, the idea of the balance of nature, almost pre-ecological thinking, but within the construct of what the seventh generation Native Americans tell us. Just how do you make a decision? You make it by the seventh generation out. Because whatever you decide now will be paid for by someone 7 generations from now. So there were many parts of the North American Native community that was also linked to us. DZQ in Sacramento, the Royal Chicano Air Force, Jose Montoya, Juanichi, many of those people were all connected to Jack Forbes and other writers who wrote about the Chicanos of Aztlán. So we lived within that thinking, and I think now we're being asked questions about how can you be indigenous when you're mestizos and you've lived in this country most of your lives. And I think it's an important conversation to have. I don't have an answer to it, but I do think that we share something with other indigenous people in terms of our values and our way of thinking about what we make. But, I think it's a big, big discussion that we need to have among ourselves, even before we try to sort it out with Mexican indigenous, as we did with Native Americans back in the 80s. we had some of those conversations. But yeah, don't have an answer. Wish I did.
The microphone is, yeah. This should be the last question.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's been so informative. I'm curious about your use of glass. Is this something that you just happened upon, or was it something you were thinking about? Did you get any special training, or did you have people who helped you? Because it's just extraordinary, especially that stream, which I think is so beautiful.
Well, that stream, those rocks were done by Viva Paredes. She's listed on the label. She is a friend of mine, another artist. The original ones were blown for me by a young man who was a glass blower. He's a glass worker. But he hurt his back and he couldn't do them anymore. And when I went to open the crate to get ready for the show, all the rocks were gone, the original ones. I have no idea where they went to. So I had to really, call on my friendship with Viva to ask her to please make me new ones. What is not visible is that every rock has the names of 2 to 3 families on them. And they were originally made from families of my own and of other immigrants that I knew. And I've expanded it in the last few years to Jewish friends and European friends whose families were the first to come to the country. And then this last time I added the names of the dead because they cross another kind of river. But I came upon glass because there was something I needed to do, but I couldn't do it. And it started with the piece that's called Transparent Migrations, those maguey plants. I actually foolishly thought I would have like 40 of them in a field, and then the little house be in the middle. And then I paid for 2 and realized, okay, well, that's it. We will not have a field. And I did that for the Road to Aztlán, which was curated by Virginia Fields, and both of them are gone now, and Victor Zamudio Taylor for LACMA. And they decided it was an archaeological show. They decided at the last minute to give us a room for Chicano and Mexican artists. There were like 5 of us. And I designed that piece for it. And it was the idea that our migration takes us through the land and we survive on the land. And the maguey is a perfect example. But I didn't have 40, I had 2. So I have never blown glass because I've suffered from pulmonary diseases for at least 30 years. So there would be no chance. But I found other people that will work with me. That's what I meant when I said earlier that my materiality is driven by the story. If I need to tell the story in a certain way, and I can't do that because I lack the skills or the capacity, then I find other people to work with. And after the accident, which is now 20 years, I started fabricating with others because, as I sit here now holding this microphone, is hurting my elbow. It's a prosthetic elbow and it's 10 years old, so it doesn't have much life left in it. So I'm learning to write and draw with my left hand, which I did when I first had the accident. I did a series of drawings and I wrote most of my letters with my left hand. And I'm going back to it now because I think that my right hand has only got about a few years left and I won't be able to use it very well. But, as artists, we find ways to get to what we're looking for. I did my own work for probably the first 30 years. But these last years, I find it's much harder for me. And I have, for the first time, an assistant. I did all of that work without an assistant for over 40 years. I just never thought of it, and I didn't know anybody else that did what I did because I fell between so many categories. It wasn't like I go ask another painter to help me. Maybe a sculptor, but not even that, because all I do is take furniture and amend it. I cut the sides off drawers, and I pummel chairs, and I just do whatever is necessary. Thank you.